Good afternoon, everybody. This is Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA, here for our April 18th. Yes, thank you for reminding me I have the webinar I'm currently doing. April 18th, 2019 legislative update, and we will get right into it. Quick political update. For those of you who have not seen anything today, the Mueller report is out on President Trump's relationship or lack of relationship with the Russian government during the last campaign. The consequence of that is that there will be nothing done in Washington today or the rest of this week, or probably a good chunk of next week, as everybody tries to read the 800 whatever page report and decide why it confirms everything they believed before the report came out. In addition to the Mueller report, House Democrats are getting ready to launch a number of investigations into the president and the administration. I've mentioned these two things not because they have anything to do with IEEE, but merely to point out that political tensions in Washington are pretty high, and they're likely to get higher, which does make it tricky for us to get anything of substance done, although we'll talk about some areas that we're actually making some progress. The news from late yesterday is Terry McAuliffe, former governor of Virginia, will not be running for president. I thought it might be easier to mention who's not running rather than go through the list of names who are running. I think in a kind of more general way, the large field of candidates, and at the moment there are around 20 Democrats either running for president or about to start running for president, people like former Vice President Joe Biden, who is not technically declared but is likely to do so shortly. I think the large fields of candidates are going to become the norm in presidential elections. We saw one in 2016 where the Republicans had 16 candidates running. Now we have 20 Democrats running. What's going on now is social media, the internet, has made it very, very difficult, very, very easy for candidates to talk to people and to get noticed and to get their name out to the public, which means it takes a lot less energy and a lot less time to kind of get noticed, to get started as a candidate. Along with the fact that there is just simply a tremendous amount of money sloshing around the political system, lots of people who are willing to give very large checks to people to run for president or for any other office at this point, which means it's not that difficult for relatively obscure candidates to raise a couple $1 million, which goes a long way in Iowa and New Hampshire, and to run a social media campaign through Facebook, through Twitter, through viral emails and that sort of thing, that get them enough attention to have perhaps an outside chance of capturing the nomination. It's not likely, but it's much easier to make kind of that base threshold required to keep a campaign active. And as a result, we're going to see these large pools of candidates, I suspect, for most presidential elections for at least a little while. All of which means that partisan tensions are very high, likely to get higher. The fact that about half of the Democrats in the Senate are running for president means that they're not terribly focused on legislative matters, but are focusing on getting attention and getting noticed, which requires a different set of activities and creates a different set of incentives. So with that as background, let's start on the 2020 budget. We're fairly early in the budget process, but we've completed kind of the first step, which is the appropriators asking for input from their colleagues. The appropriators are now working on drafting the first iteration of the budget bills, the appropriations bills. The Democrats in the House are moving ahead very aggressively with hearings. They've set some very, I think, optimistic deadlines for themselves. Their goal is to get all of the appropriations bills done, and by that I mean passed out of the House, by July. That is almost certainly not going to happen, but they might be able to get them done by the end of July, which is traditionally when legislators have tried to get their bills completed before the August recess. Seems a bit optimistic, but they're at least moving ahead aggressively to accomplish that. The Senate is, by necessity, moving slower. The Senate can't draft the appropriations bills. They have to start in the House. But they are also holding hearings and gathering information and kind of getting ready to start drafting their own versions as soon as they can. We don't have any actual legislation yet. That's not uncommon or unusual. We don't usually start seeing bills until the end of May. But we've had a large number of good conversations with appropriators and other key legislative figures to try to figure out what's going to happen. Sequestration is likely to complicate things. For those of you who forget, sequestration was an Obama administration proposal that was adopted by the Republicans back 2012, 2010. I've forgotten exactly when off the top of my head, which places caps on discretionary funding. There's a Defense Department cap and there's a cap for everybody else. These caps are supposed to push down federal spending to try to get the deficit under control. Now, for the past several years, those sequestration limits have been breached. We expect that to happen again this year, but the fact that the sequestration limits exist complicates the budget process and will slow down the appropriators. Like I said, I expect them to eventually breach the caps and increase spending as they've been doing fairly regularly for the past several years, but it's going to be a little harder to do. I'm also going to mention that the debt ceiling is going to have to be increased at some point this fall as we bump up against the statutory limits on how much the federal government can spend. They are obviously going to raise those limits because otherwise the U.S. government goes into default and the entire global economy starts to collapse, which is bad. But again, the debt ceiling debate is going to take up legislative time. It's going to be a fight, and it will slow the appropriations process down again. All of which means I don't expect Congress to finish all of the appropriations bills by October 1st, nor even by January 1st. But at the moment, they're on track to make a reasonable attempt at getting at least some of them passed. Of course, the hard part is getting the House bill written by Democrats to match the Senate bill written by Republicans, and then both of them producing a document that the president accepts. But at the moment, let's just pretend that everything's moving rather smoothly, because at the moment, it is. Some updated information on immigration policy. There's a couple things going on that are of note. Immigration and visa policy, I should say. First of all, there is a high-skill green card bill that has been drafted. It has not been introduced yet. That would make it create an unlimited number of green cards for STEM graduate students. This is very similar to the STEM Jobs Act that we almost got passed back in 2012, except that that bill was capped. There was only 40,000 visas available, 50,000 visas available for graduate students. This draft would be an unlimited number, which means it's unlikely to pass. The big challenge on high-skill immigration reform, almost everybody on Capitol Hill agrees that we should make it easier for international graduate students to become Americans. The basic principle is widely accepted. The problem is, where do the visas come from? Democrats want to create an uncapped visa category or create a bunch of new visas for graduate students. Republicans don't want to increase the number of visas at all and want to take the visas from other programs, most typically the diversity visa program, although there's been proposals to take them from family visas as well. At the moment, we've been completely unable to bridge that gap. I'm hoping that once some pieces of legislation appear and we have an actual debate on real bills, perhaps we can move people to a position of compromise, although it's difficult to figure out what those will be. On the H-1B front, the administration has made it more difficult for companies to get and to use H-1B visas. The most recent piece of data we have are some good numbers on denial rates. That is, it used to be companies applied for an H-1B visa and they were approved, unless they did something stupid like forget to fill in all the blanks on the form. Denial rates in the low single digits, mid-single digits were typical. The most recent numbers from 2018 had a 32% denial rate for H-1B applications. That's 4 or 5 times what we traditionally have seen. And what this shows us is that the administration is actively policing the H-1B applications now. Whereas past administrations, Republican and Democrat, simply rubber stamped all the H-1B applications, the Trump administration is now actually reading them and denying large numbers that they feel don't meet the statutory requirements of the program. Also worth noting that denial rates for renewals are up. Not nearly as high. We're looking at 18% denial rate for renewals in 2018, but these are workers that are currently using an H-1B, and the H-1B is good for 3 years and renewable for an additional 3. The administration, it used to be that renewal process was automatic. If a company asks for it, they got it. Now the administration is saying, well, no, let's take a look and make sure this job is still suitable for an H-1B worker. And like I said, almost 20% of the renewals are being rejected. Unfortunately, a large number of H-1Bs are still finding their way to the outsourcing companies. The outsourcing companies are still using the visa to replace Americans with non-American workers who are never allowed to become Americans. But it does appear that the process is getting more expensive, it's getting more cumbersome, it's getting less predictable, all of which makes the outsourcing model more difficult. In addition, administration rule changes have led to a higher percentage of H-1Bs going to workers with masters or PhDs who typically have higher paying jobs. Doesn't mean they're not displacing an American, but it does mean it's less likely that they're displacing an American, which is very good. So all of this is encouraging. However, there's a downside. The administration is also making it more difficult for foreign nationals to get student visas and short-term visitor visas into the United States. We expect more, right now the restrictions on student visas apply mostly to Chinese students. We expect more restrictions on student visas to apply more draconian restrictions on student visas, Chinese students rather, and other restrictions on all student visas, generally making it harder to get a student visa. We're seeing increasing denials and delays in the short-term visitor visa category. In this context, that's typically tourists, but more importantly, short-term business visitors, which would include conference attendees. We've seen a number of IEEE members unable to get a visa under odd circumstances, and I've heard from my colleagues in other associations that they are also seeing an increased number of visas being denied and the wait time for visas going up dramatically, all of which is making it harder for anyone to come to the United States, but particularly for conference attendees and other professionals like that, which we, of course, have concerns about. I actually have a meeting just after this call with USCIS to get more information on what exactly is going on and where they plan on going with all of that. Hodgepodge of some energy things going on. We still have not really seen a big energy bill emerge or get a clear sense of kind of what Congress wants to do on kind of what big things they want to do. But we got some smaller ones. S-47, the National Resource Management Act, deals with the use of energy production on federal lands and the other use of federal lands. And that doesn't have a huge impact on us, but it could touch on us for a number of things like solar power, like high voltage power lines, things like that. But I did want to draw your attention to it because it is a bipartisan bill. Senator Murkowski from Alaska, Senator Cantwell from Washington are both pushing the bill. Energy policy remains one of the few areas that are genuinely bipartisan, at least in the Senate, which is optimistic. The president issued a couple executive orders in the last few weeks on the energy infrastructure, most of which deal with coal, oil, and natural gas and are not things that we're terribly concerned about. But there's a few things in there that could be useful to us. There's some language on right-of-ways and finding ways to make it bureaucratically easier to move energy across political jurisdictions. Now, that's targeted at natural gas and oil pipelines, but it might also be useful for power lines. And the president has asked he's ordered his administration to find ways to reduce barriers to forming a national national energy market. And again, that's looking predominantly at natural gas and oil, but it can also apply to electrical energy grids and markets. And so both of these may have implications for IEEE members. There is a movement led by Senator Merkley from Oregon, Democrat from Oregon, and Grassley, Republican from Iowa, to promote wind energy research. A letter, Dear Colleague letter, has gone out from the two of them, signed by more than half the Senate, supporting investments in wind research, which is encouraging. And on a state level, Pennsylvania has a bill in its legislature to provide resources to revitalize and save the Pennsylvania nuclear industry. Pennsylvania, Westinghouse, more specifically, does a lot of work globally building nuclear power plants. And because the United States isn't doing any of that, that industry has been withering. The Pennsylvania State House wants to keep that industry alive in Pennsylvania. And so it's $500 million, which is not nothing, to promote and protect the domestic nuclear energy industry. Some exciting things on artificial intelligence. A ton of bills in Congress have been introduced. Most of them are just messaging bills, just bills designed to let legislators say, look, I did something on AI. But there's a couple important ones in there that could move. Congress is looking directly at ways to restrain corporations and corporate activities on the internet. They're very concerned about privacy and data management, although it's not clear on exactly what they mean by that or what they plan to do about it. They're also focused on messaging, and now we're talking about fake news, harassment, hate speech, things like that on the internet, which are less a concern to IEEE, but certainly a concern to IEEE members. No clear path forward. We don't really know. I don't think Congress really knows what they want to do about this yet, but they are starting to talk about, for the last couple of years, they've been talking in general terms, kind of philosophically, what do they want legislation to do? Now they're starting to write the legislation, and so the conversation is turning much more concrete and much more direct. Towards that end, the House is organizing an advisory group of experts to help legislators make sense of AI technology and the direction of AI in general. That advisory group will include a number of industry groups, but the House has very clearly and deliberately reached out to a number of nonprofit groups and asked them to not specifically, but effectively act as a counterbalance to the industry groups. And IEEE-USA was one of those groups. We were specifically asked to provide experts to serve on that panel who were not representatives of industry. And we have done that and intend to participate in this effort as it gets organized. A couple things on cybersecurity. A lot like AI, and there's a relationship between the two. A lot of bills on cybersecurity, most of which are messaging bills, a lot of which deal with kind of the bureaucracy of the federal government, who is in charge, who has authority, which is interesting and important, but not something we get all that involved in. I just wanted to point out an article in the Washington Post from today, Cybersecurity 202. This is the biggest problem with cybersecurity research. I only point this out because everybody in Washington reads the Washington Post, and so if they think cybersecurity research is important, other people in this city are going to think they're important, and therefore it's important. Another article that appeared earlier this week in The Hill, which is a newspaper for Capitol Hill, cybersecurity doesn't stop at the federal level. That was responding to a couple bills, well, one in particular, that have been introduced in the House, the State Cyber Resiliency Act, introduced by Representative Kilmer, Democrat from Washington, and McCall, a Republican from Texas. Both powerful legislators, so this is an important bill. The bill would create federal grants to help states with their cybersecurity efforts. Also wanted to point out H.R. 2115 from Bobby Rush, senior Democrat from Illinois, Enhancing State Energy Security Planning and Emergency Preparedness Act, blah, 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 tough one to read. But among many other things, this provides federal grants to help states protect their energy infrastructure, which would also include cybersecurity. Pointing these out just to note that when you're talking about vulnerabilities in our infrastructure, particularly our energy infrastructure, the federal government obviously needs to get its cyber protections up, but a lot of this falls on state and local and the industry. And state and local governments are way behind on securing their cyber systems from vulnerabilities. For example, one of the findings of the Mueller report is that apparently hostile foreign actors, probably Russians, did penetrate the Florida election system. Now, having said that, it's not at all clear what that means. Having worked in elections and run elections, I can tell you that getting access to the state board of election website or computer systems does not allow you to change the vote. That voting is actually very decentralized in this country, which is a good thing. And so just because they got access to the state election computers does not mean that they can change the results of the election, although I don't know how Florida runs things, so I'm not sure that's true in the case of Florida. But it is, of course, a concern, and states and local municipalities have been way behind the federal government when it comes to protecting their systems, and the federal government hasn't been terribly up on this either. And so bills like H.R. 1344 and 2115 are necessary to help states with the resources, the expertise, and to kind of nudge them into doing what they need to do to protect their systems. A couple other issues just to mention. H.R. 1328, the Access Broadband Act, introduced by Democrat Representative Tonko from New York. Tonko introduced this bill the last couple Congresses. It promotes rural broadband, and it's something that we've supported in the past and will likely support again. Announcement out of the FCC that they will be blocking China Mobile from the U.S. market. This is consistent with the Trump administration's efforts to respond to China's cyber espionage efforts and to reduce our vulnerabilities to Chinese cyber efforts. In a related note, FCC Chairman Ajit Pai will be testifying before the House on May 15th on a bunch of things, including robocalls and net neutrality and a number of other things. It should be a lively conversation because the Democrats in the House are not big fans of Mr. Pai's, and so that hearing will likely be quite testy, which is always fun. Another note, because a number of IEEE members have mentioned it, S151, the Traced Act from Senator Thune, Republican, South Dakota, and Markey, Democrat from Massachusetts, creates a number of harsher penalties for robocalls and unsolicited phone calls. It passed the Senate committee earlier this week and will likely pass the Senate at some point. There is a companion bill in the House, although it is not moved much at the moment and is not identical, but this seems to be something, a bipartisan thing that could actually happen. I wanted to give you a quick update on our CVD, which happened on April 2nd and 3rd. It was a tremendous success this year, our biggest CVD ever. We had 70 participants from 19 different states and District of Columbia, so 20 separate jurisdictions. We met with 92 members of Congress, which is a pretty good percentage, and that total included 18 of the freshmen, which is fantastic because it gave us a great opportunity to introduce ourselves. The CVD focused on federal spending for research and development, We talked about immigration. We talked about a couple of other things, data privacy being a key one. And so these were fantastic ways to introduce ourselves to and introduce the IEEE membership to members of Congress, and in particular our freshmen. Those of you who would like to participate next year, we will be holding the 2020 CVD the last week of March or the first week of April. We have to secure meeting space on Capitol Hill before we can lock it in, which means it probably won't be until December or January before we have the exact date. But that's what we're thinking of. If you're interested, send me an email. We'll get you on the list so you will find out the minute we know what day it will be so you can register with as much notice as possible. Little note, some of you may have noticed, may have heard the news. Astronomers successfully photographed a black hole. I do not know what that means, but I do know that it is very cool. Dr. Katie Bowman was highlighted as one of the professionals that was responsible for some of the cool math that went into allowing this to happen. The press reported that Dr. Bowman did this. She didn't. She was one of many people that made this happen. But it's worth noting that Dr. Katie Bowman, who played a critical role in producing that picture, is an MIT grad. More importantly, she is an IEEE member and apparently an active member of the IEEE Signal Processing Society. So we congratulate Dr. Bowman and the folks that run the Signal Processing Society for her great work. Our next update will be May 16th. I know I'm disturbed that it's already almost May as well, at 1 o'clock Eastern. And with that, Diana, do we have any questions?
No, Russ, I have not received any questions at this time.
Very good. As always, you can send me an email directly at r.t.harrison@ieee.org or call me at 202-530-8326. And with that, thank you all for joining us. I'm Russ Harrison with IEEE-USA. I look forward to talking with you in May. Have a good afternoon.